Institute for Global Dialogue says Africa lacks visionary and courageous leaders such as Nelson Mandela, Thomas Sankara and others. Well, it says new leaders need to be capable of meeting the increasingly complex challenges it faces. As we continue to mark Africa Day here, we discuss this now with Philani Mthembu from the Institute for Global Dialogue. Philani, good morning. Happy Africa Day to you. And let's just look at the common perception that Africa is run by a bunch of power-hungry old men who will do anything to cling to power, dictators as such, to enrich themselves. How far off the mark is that as we speak now in 2021?
Well, thank you for having me. I think we shouldn't be discouraged necessarily by that perception. I think when we think about leadership in general, the reason why we always remember leaders who drive society forward is because they are by no means the norm. Throughout history, I think if you look at other continents in the world, they've largely been led by ordinary people, and then every now and then a visionary leader will come up that actually drives society forward. And I think as Africans, we are no exception to other human beings around the world. And that is why when we have had visionary leaders on the continent, we remember them, we revere them. But I also think what's important to remember is that throughout human development, societies are driven forward not only from the top, but they are also driven forward by the struggles of ordinary people. And I think it's also incumbent upon us, so leaders in various parts of societies, in the communities, in the churches, in youth movements, civil society, research. It's upon all of us to play our role in actually driving leadership forward. Because I think any leader that leads a society that keeps them on their toes and that keeps them and holds them accountable, we actually elevate their ability to lead.
Well, Philani, let's look at where that might have happened on the continent, because as you say, change is often seen as something that is brought about by a country's people. But if we're speaking honestly about people in Africa, most of them busy trying to stay alive. We're dealing with almost always issues of, whether an election in certain African countries are actually free and fair. Vote rigging comes up all the time. And, who can then bring about, how can they bring about change? How can the people of Africa bring about the change that they need?
Well, when we take a snapshot look at the continent, it's easy to become discouraged because we see, the fights over elections. We see those in power treating opposition parties as enemies rather than as people who are living in the same society and trying to drive their countries forward. So it's easy to get discouraged if we take a snapshot view. But if we take a historical view of the continent, we would see that in the past few decades, the number of wars that are happening on the continent have decreased. We would see that you do have a rising middle class, no matter how vulnerable that middle class is on the continent. And I think all those changes, we have a young population with massive expectations, a population that will double by 2050. And they have expectations. They want jobs created. They want decent livelihoods. So all of those elements are what is going to actually propel the continent forward. So it's easy, yes, to get discouraged because we see the challenges. But I think if we compare where we are as a continent to where we were 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years ago, we would see that gradually there is progress being made on certain areas. There are areas of encouragement in terms of regional integration, in terms of establishing the continental free trade area and the type of potential that holds for the continent.
Well, let's highlight some of those success stories then. Where are they getting it right on the continent? For a while, Ethiopia was seen as, our success story. Is that still the case? Would that be? And South Africa, I mean, we've got our fair share of troubles. We're supposed to be seen as a leader on the continent, but many might disagree right now with the state of our politics.
I think it's important at this stage for South Africa to reevaluate its role in Africa and in the world. For many years, we were de facto seen as a leading country within the continent. But we noticed that in the past few years, because of our domestic challenges, our leadership role actually took a backseat on the continent. So we need to do a real honest examination of where we are. We need to understand how South Africa is perceived within Africa, and not take for granted that our leadership is taken, you know, as something that is not questionable. So we need to listen more, listen to what others are saying about us in Africa. But I think we also shouldn't shy away from taking a leadership role on areas that we value as a country. And I think it takes a few countries on the continent to drive the progress of the continent and to drive the vision of regional integration forward. And I think as a country, as we re-examine ourselves domestically, but also in the world, it's important that as part of our renewal process at home, it also translates into a renewal process within the continent, so that we are able to drive leadership processes. Because if we don't do it, we let a vacuum on the continent, and others will drive it forward. And they may not necessarily have the same views as us.
Yeah, well, I agree on that one. Well, let's look at bodies that are working or supposed to be working on the continent, the likes of the AU and the African Union and SADC, which are most people consider quite useless or ineffective in fulfilling their actual role. I mean, how do we use those tools at our disposal? How could they function better? Or do we need to do away with them and come up with something new?
We don't need to do away with them, but I do think we need to bring them closer to the people. At the moment, our continental bodies, there's a gap between the leadership at a continental level and the people on the ground. So when we think about regional integration, we think about the formal processes driven by SADC, driven by the African Union and other bodies. But we don't always connect what happens in those bodies with what is actually happening on the ground. For instance, there's a disconnect between the informal traders that are crossing our borders and really just trying to ensure their livelihoods, and the type of agreements that we're seeing at a continental level. So we need to bring regional integration closer to the people, so that it's not driven by state actors only, but it has to be driven by state actors, it has to be driven by civil society. We have to do more in terms of integrating our regions and ensuring that young people get opportunities to also not only be exposed to their own countries, but to be exposed to their neighboring countries. And make sure that integration is people-driven, supported by the state and private sector, but it has to be driven from the ground. Otherwise, the disconnect gets wider.
All right, Philani Mthembu, thank you very much for that insight on this Africa Day. How are we faring in terms of leadership on the continent? Not so well at the moment. Well, we'll